What's up, everybody? Welcome to Arms Room 15 podcast. Again, just a couple of guys discussing the Second Amendment. And today, that is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to be discussing some talking points that a lot of people like to bring up about the Second Amendment and some, not falsities, but some bad beliefs, if that's right.
Misconceptions?
Misconceptions. That's what I was trying to get at. Misconceptions. So today, we're directly talking about the Second Amendment. We're going to get into this, and we're going to just explore what that meant. So, Devin, one of the biggest things when people talk about the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So, obviously, I know the Second Amendment, that's just an abbreviated version, but when it says well-regulated militia, a lot of people like to point to that and say, see, it even says regulated, as in regulations and government, but that doesn't make sense to me, coming from a bunch of people who are literally trying to fight for their freedoms.
Right. So, one of the biggest things about it... Okay, so first and foremost, now we have to understand, one, language changes.
Yep.
All right, so there's plenty of words or definitions that we used to be used back in the day. I mean, not even 50 years ago, there were words that were used that are now considered, if you use them, they're basically slurs against people, right? But back then, they meant something completely different. Right? Sort of the same thing with that, right?
And I'm going to say something that's a little controversial, okay? That's the only word that I really know that I know for a matter of fact was changed over time, and that is the word gay.
Yeah.
Having a gay time did not mean what it means in 2023.
No, it didn't. And
unfortunately, they, like you said, they have turned it into a slur. It has become a slur.
Right.
Against people who are of that orientation or same-sex mindset, or however you want to put it. Insert your title here. I'm not here to judge. I don't really care. That's between you and him.
But that's an excellent example of something that's changed over time, and within only 50 years or so. And now imagine 250 years, things are going to change.
Yeah.
Now, the word regulated did still in multiple definitions back then mean, have regulations and things like that, order and all that.
Okay.
However, we're not talking about the word regulated, and we're not even talking about the word well. We're talking about well-regulated with a dash.
Well-regulated with a dash in between. Okay.
All right. So I have a little cheat sheet here.
All right, it's a book.
Yep, book here. Before we go into well-regulated, I do want to point out sort of a origin.
Okay.
All right, of kind of where the mindset of the Second Amendment started originating before even the Constitution started being built, before the term well-regulated started being written in regards to it. Okay, so...
Wait a minute. The Bill of Rights is what has the amendments in it. That's where they first started talking about it, right? No.
No, they started talking... I mean, if you think about it, without the Second Amendment, even the mindset of using the Second Amendment started with the beginning of the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
All right? So I'm not... here's the thing about me. I don't like to just say stuff. I like to quote what the actual people who were talking about said.
Okay.
All right.
So it's like fact checking.
Right. I don't
from the people in the past.
Right. I'm not going to be like, oh, hey, yeah, it totally means this. It's like, well, what did they say it meant? Because that's who wrote it. The people who wrote it knew what it meant. So what did they say?
It's kind of like when you're doing like a Bible study and you're like, oh, well, this is what this means and this is what that means, and it's like, what does the word say beyond the words?
Right.
Why don't we just look at the Greek and Hebrew in the language it was written to figure out what it means?
And actually, that's a good point, because the best way to interpret Scripture is with other Scripture.
Right.
The best way to interpret the Founding Fathers is with the founding fathers.
Makes sense to me. Let's do it.
It's kind of the same way. Like if you were to say something, I wouldn't want your word, or you wouldn't want your words to be misconstrued to mean just anything.
Right.
You want them to be within the context of what you said, right? So the best way to interpret you is with you. All
okay.
Right? So we're going to do that.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So we're going to start with the document that you might have heard of, the Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence.
Right?
Yeah.
This is kind of the first, I suppose, the written hint about what you're going to see in the future with the Second Amendment.
Okay.
All right. So we all kind of know. I'm sure a lot of people have actually heard some of this stuff.
Okay.
But what I want to point out is, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, invices a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, which is tyranny.
Okay.
All right. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So even starting in the Declaration, it's talking about, hey, when a government starts being bad, being tyranny, it's not only the right but the duty of the people to cast it off.
So for those who might want to look this up, where is that at in the Declaration?
It's right in kind of in the middle.
Middle?
Maybe like first third.
First third, okay.
Yeah, so it's not hard to. It's not a very long document, so it's not hard to find it.
Okay.
You only maybe get about a third away when you start all that
So
stuff.
it says it's not only their right, but it is their duty to act upon such things.
Right.
Man, what do you think they'd say if they saw 2023?
Oh man, dude, they would just sit there and be like, "Why aren't
probably
y'all
throw us all off."
It's like, dude, why aren't y'all doing something? And actually, he addresses this.
Okay.
Thomas Jefferson addresses we think about it, it's like, why aren't we doing anything, right? He talks about that actually in the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
And
Going back to the Declaration
it says,
of Independence.
Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
Okay, so hit that to me like I'm a 5-year-old.
Yeah, so basically it's saying people would rather deal with the bad things than all the crazy,
the pain
stupid,
and suffering. I got that part.
all the crazy, stupid things that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah.
They'd rather just deal with it and complain probably than to actually do what is necessary to get rid of it and move on. They'd rather suffer under it. Walt actually he would say, they are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. All right, sufferable meaning they're allowed, right? They're allowing evils in their government, in their country, and they'd rather do that than to right themselves. All right, it's harder, it's easier. They're basically taking the easy way out.
Right.
It's easier to just deal with it and move on than it is, because
I think personally that's why we have any gun control at all, is because of people before us that have said, you know what, to get along we got to go along, so let's go along with this, and maybe they won't go no further in the future.
It's easier to go along with something than it is. Confrontation is always hard.
Sure.
Regardless of what level of confrontation.
Regardless of what subject you're talking about, confrontation is never easy.
Right. Even if it's just protesting, all the way up to the most extreme version of protest, which would be rebellion or insurrection of some sort, right? Any kind of anything, any level is, and it just gets harder the higher you go.
Right.
All right. And of course, I think you should exhaust every possible, confrontation, the lowest levels.
Oh yeah, always.
Before you ever get to any kind of
always try the peace side before you have to go to the most extreme side, which is the insurrection and rebellion, like you said.
Right. So, and I would never, and quite honestly, ask any veteran, the last thing we would ever want is civil war.
Right.
Because I want to point that out, because I want to be like, because I guarantee people that you're calling for civil war, man. It's like, no.
It's funny because so are other people on this topic.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, a lot of people who call for it and are really hard charging for it, never had to be in that kind of situation, or even close to it, to where ask any veteran, they're gonna be like, "Nah, you don't want that."
Right.
You think you want that, you don't want that.
Well, what I find funny is, and this is not an indictment of any one person or any one group of people. So if you're offended, go ahead and type it in the comments. I'm offended. Let us get some traction on that. I don't personally care. Be offended. But here's the thing. There are people on one side of the aisle who are not typically pro-gun, who recently have become a lot more pro-gun and have videotaped themselves with magazines and firearms, like loading magazine into a firearm or racking it or holding it or whatever they're doing, and they're saying, let's start a civil war over it. If you don't want to follow what we're doing, then let's start a civil war. And I laugh at that because I'm like, they would be the first ones to cower and run away if a bullet went past their head.
Once they hear that snap, I mean, think about it this way: they want to call for. They were using non-lethal means during some of those protests a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And just from the non-lethal stuff, they were freaking out. They were getting scared and cowering.
Well, speaking of the non-lethal stuff, what's supposed to be non-lethal, there was a protest where I lived in Indiana, and like when the riots were getting real bad and they were all over every major city in the United States, one of the people that was protesting, my brother can attest to this because we both lived in the same city. Actually, all three of me and my two brothers lived in the same city at the time. There was a protester that ended up taking a 40 mic to the eye.
Yeah, that's gonna...
He had to have like all kind of facial construction surgeries and everything. But it's because, again, if you're going to protest, you do it peacefully. I'm all for, like he said, start at the lower peaceful levels first. We start here.
Yeah, because once you start getting into that more violent side, violence begets violence.
Yeah.
And you won't like the other. It's easy to dish it out. Once you start taking it, it's a different. Once you start seeing, especially if you go like actual civil war, once you see your best buddy get blown out in half by a stinking 50 cal, things change. Your brain changes.
Oh yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, maybe I don't want to be here.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's a. So I will never ever advocate for civil war, regardless if I, in my mind, might be like, I think it's coming. I'm gonna be like, let's try to do this the easy way.
So I watched a video today, and there was a guy. He's very well known. I almost don't even want to say his name.
Don't say his name.
Okay, because like he's very controversial. But anyways, he said, believe me, they are trying to go for the guns, they're trying to go for this, they're trying to go for that, and he said, and I promise you, there will be another 1776 if anything like that happens, and they know it and they're scared. Talking about the government.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if I think it'll be more closer to a civil war, like 1800 civil war, than Revolutionary War. I don't think, because I would see it more as a civil war, not a 17. It won't be a 1776, because we're not casting our own government on. We're just kind of reverting it back to how it should be. Right. Kind of thing. So I would think it would be closer to, it would be like I guess maybe a mixture. Okay. But speaking of that kind of stuff, let's go back to the founders.
Let's get back into
it. Right from that era, right? So let's go into, so we were talking about well regulated, right? Yeah. So we were talking off screen about how the Constitution itself, prior to, so people may not know, the Constitution was written before the Bill of Rights, all right, which is where the Second Amendment resides.
Okay.
Okay. It was written before that, and during its ratification time, people were debating. They would take it to each state. The representatives of each of those states would come in, look it over, and they would start debating on which one's good, what points are good, what points are bad, what needs to be changed, or whether we should ratify it, what shouldn't ratify it, that kind of thing, right?
Okay.
So, in doing that, a lot of them were noticing that it talks about the militia, but it doesn't, well, let me just read it. This is what Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12 through 15, or at least in that section. I think this is 14 and 15. This is the section that talks about the responsibilities of the government.
Okay.
Specifically for military forces. And there's two parts that discuss the militia. All right. So the government is to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And second, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So that's what the Constitution said.
Okay.
Okay, that's really all it says about the militia. Okay, which concern the people of the states. Can you see why it might have done that?
Were they concerned because they were afraid that the government would take over the militia?
Yes. Basically, it gives so much power to the federal government over the militia,
right?
That it makes it sound like only what the government says can go as far as militias go.
And so let's be clear here: the militia does not mean the military. We're not talking
Correct.
about the U.S. military, our armed forces. We're
Correct.
not which were built way back when all this was going on.
Yeah, so according to the Dictionary of the English Language by Samuel Johnson, 1792 edition,
Okay.
which is the same year that the Bill of Rights was written, okay, the definition of militia is the train bands. Now, the definition of train bands is a part of the community trained to martial exercise.
Part of the community.
Yes.
Okay.
So militias back
not
then.
Not armed servicemen, not police officers.
Nope. So
community people.
Exactly. So back then, militia was part of the community. You were a part of your community, and your community had a militia, and that could be called up.
So isn't that kind of like the National Guard then?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. And there's a reason why. First, we have to find out. I want to discuss what the original militia, because there was an original militia act of 1792, and then it got replaced by the Efficiency of Militia Act. Okay.
Okay.
So but I want to talk about the. We'll talk about the original first.
Okay.
Here in a moment, but before we do that, I want to say a couple quotes. So with those two things in mind, the stuff that's inside the Constitution, right, regarding the Patrick Henry during the debates, the Virginia ratification debates for the Constitution, he said this: "My great objection to this government is that it does not leave us the means of defending our rights or waging wars against tyrants."
Against that current government.
Any government, anyone that would be tyrants for defending our rights.
Okay.
Okay. Then we have, make sure to get his name, Representative Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts.
Okay.
All right. So this is the Massachusetts debates.
Massachusetts is a very pro-gun control state.
Yeah. Now.
now.
Back then, none of them were.
So
back then,
let's hear what he had to say.
So he says, "What, sir, is the use of a militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the bane of liberty." So he even considered a standing army as to be not good for liberty.
Really?
Okay. Now, it must be evident that under this provision, together with their other powers, Congress could take such measures with respect to the militia as to make a standing army necessary. Whenever governments mean to invade the rights and liberties of the people, they always attempt to destroy the militia in order to raise an army upon their ruins. This was actually done by Great Britain at the commencement of the late Revolution. Okay. They used every means in their power to prevent the establishment of an effective militia to the eastward. The Assembly of Massachusetts, seeing the rapid progress that administration were making to divest them of their inherent privileges, endeavors to counteract them by the organization of the militia, but they were always defeated by the influence of the crown.
Always defeated by the influence of the crown. So they tried to create this before, and it got crushed down.
Right.
And so, what was it saying about a standing army? So break that down.
So some of the founding fathers had an issue. Not all of them.
Okay.
There was a big debate between whether the United States should have a standing army or just have a militia.
So just a community-based thing, but all across the whole country.
Right.
Meaning, like, if it came down to defending the country, the people would rise up, not just a one specific group.
Right. Now, obviously, that was actually more of a minority idea. Was this the standing army kind of idea? But the sentiment of the government using or trying to destroy the militia to destroy rights was almost universally agreed upon in the groups.
Okay.
Whether they believe that the standing army should be a thing was always, they may not have agreed with that, but they did agree that, hey, the government should be put in check by the militia. Okay. So.
Wait, say that again. The government should be put in check by the militia.
Yes.
Man. Okay.
Yeah. So, and actually, and that the said Constitution be never construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the right of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. That was Sam Adams.
Wow.
Also from Massachusetts, 1788. Again, during debates of the Constitution.
Right. But so this is when they were actually developing the Bill of Rights, not.
This actually predates the Bill of Rights. This is when they were this is when they were debating the Constitution and being like, basically what happened is when they said they were going to ratify it, but if we ratify it, you have to guarantee that we can reconvene and develop a Bill of Rights. So, which is why the Bill of Rights came after the Constitution. So the Constitution was ratified. They returned, and then they made those amendments, the first 10 amendments, which was the Bill of Rights. And it's because of these debates, because they were like, hey, these things need to be established, and we need to add them to the Constitution.
So the mindset of these people that you're reading from is closer to the mindset than how any of us today interpret it. Would you agree?
Yeah. And actually, I would think they would. If you read some of their stuff, they're actually more extreme than even some of the more pro-gun people. You'll never hear anyone in Congress right now be as pro-gun as they are.
Well, no.
Even the ones on our side, quote unquote. I'll read some more of these, and you'll be like, "Wow, that's kind of hardcore."
It sounds to me like they have an agenda, that they know what they want, and that this is how they want to govern this new country that they have just fought and died for. So
And interesting, so James Madison, who is actually considered the father of the Second Amendment.
Okay.
Okay. This is a quote he made in 1789. Okay. About 3 years before the Bill of Rights was completed or ratified. Okay. So this predates, and you'll know exactly why he's called the father of the Second Amendment because of this. All right. He says, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country." Almost verbatim, rearranged a little bit, but
I
now
almost like that one better than the original.
Yeah,
okay, that one I think is the original, but
yeah, more or
I
less.
like that one better than our current one because it includes well-armed and well-regulated.
Right.
So that means, I mean, honestly, if they would have left that one part in, well-armed and well-regulated, if they would have left that one part in, I feel like we wouldn't have the Gun Control Act of, what was it, 68, right?
Or what?
The Gun Control Act of 68.
Oh, yeah. Well, that one, and that wasn't even the first one.
Right. No, there was
So,
multiple
yeah.
gun control acts, but what I'm saying is that the one where they got rid of all automatics, the one where they got rid
Oh,
of,
that was in the 30s.
I thought that was in the 60s.
No, they heavily regulated it in the 30s.
Okay, what was the
And
one in
then,
the 60s?
That was like suppressors,
Okay.
short, like dangerous
Again,
weapons.
suppressor, it's an attachment.
Right.
It does not make your gun shoot faster, doesn't make it shoot farther.
Yeah, there was 3 iterations of the NFA, the National Firearms Act.
Okay.
First one was in the 30s, because of all the gangsters and all that stuff.
Okay.
That's when it first started. That one wasn't super bad. It heavily regulated fully autos.
Okay.
Um,
Which I still think
but you could
everybody
still-
should be able to own
but
one.
you could still own them. You could still do it if they were just regulated, right? Then, in the 60s is when they really cracked down on the regulations and they added like the suppressors and all that stuff.
And in the 90s.
And then the 80s, 86
Oh, okay.
is when they, that's when like the final big push and it just completely made it. That's basically our modern iteration.
Right, and that was the assault weapons ban, right?
No, that was the 90s, and that's no longer in effect.
That was in 94, though.
Yeah, that was during Clinton.
Okay. And it expired in 2004, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right around. It expired during Bush Jr.'s.
All right, so quick
Little
rabbit trail. They had that assault weapons ban in 94, and it stopped in 2004. Tell me, what did they learn from that?
Not a whole lot, to be honest. They didn't.
I know the answer.
Here's the unfortunate thing. During that assault weapons ban, Columbine happened.
Yeah.
So it didn't stop that happening.
But more gun control means these school shootings won't happen, right?
Oh no, yeah, of course not. That's duh. No guns, no shootings.
Just
Clearly,
like,
that didn't happen.
well, I mean, it's just like, they banned drugs now, and now drugs aren't a thing, right?
Oh yeah. It's like we're being facetious, but
Yeah. But you get the idea. That's what we're trying to show you, that it doesn't matter how much regulation you put on it, how much, laws you put in place. The people who want to get a hold of them will still get a hold of them. We're not the only country that manufactures arms.
right.
So
now so now we're gonna go into actually well-regulated.
okay, well-regulated, which most people would say means government regulation.
Yeah, so we kind of saw where the mindset is, right? So now we're gonna see they're worried about the government and what it could do to our rights and freedoms and stuff, right? So it would, like you were saying earlier, kind of be counterintuitive or counteracting that idea by heavily regulating.
Right, because
the
they just
arms,
came
right?
out of a battle for freedom.
So You have, from the same dictionary of the English language, okay, the term well-regulated would basically be well-disciplined. Okay, that's kind of the, that's more of the way they were describing. And actually you can kind of see that with George Washington and how he mentions, because he uses the term well-regulated. Okay? So he says, the distinction between a well-regulated army and a mob, of course he's not talking about the militia, he's talking about the military.
Right.
All right? Now, obviously, the military isn't regulated in they're not given like heavy regulations as far as like laws.
Right.
All right? Now, obviously, they follow regulations like that are for disciplinary actions or disciplinary concepts, right? But there's not like a law that's saying, I don't know, being in the military is illegal. You know what I mean? Or something like that. You know, there's no congressional law regulating a military in that sense, not in the same sense as what you would do for law and order.
Right, but there are laws as far as like things in like military chain of command, correct?
Yeah, but that's a disciplinary thing. It's discipline. All right, so following your chain of command is a level of discipline, which is what well-regulated is. Now you can get in trouble if you don't. All right,
because
that's a break of discipline.
I heard from a friend of mine who was in Iraq, and he said that it got so bad to the point where they actually had to wait for what was it? I don't know if it was the rules of engagement, or they had to wait to fire back until they basically could not fire at anyone.
Okay, so that's
unless they were getting absolutely fired upon, and even then they had to call it in.
That's not the same as that's not the same.
Okay.
That's rules of engagement, rules of war. That's an international thing.
Okay.
We do that because of the Geneva Convention and all that stuff.
And we try to play ball,
right?
Whereas other countries don't.
That's a separate thing from what we're talking about here.
Okay.
Well-regulated, we're talking about is not rules of engagement or anything. That has nothing to do with that.
So it doesn't have anything to do with rules per se.
Right. Yeah. It's like, again, it's one of those things that since we don't use, disciplined is the only way I could really describe back then, because we keep using the word well-regulated, and people's brain will keep thinking regulation, right? That's why I'm trying to say it has nothing to do with that. It has something. It's discipline.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to read again. I'm going to go through what George Washington was talking about.
Okay.
The distinction between a well-regulated army and a mob is the good order and discipline of the first, and the licentious. That's another word that's barely used anymore. The licentious and disorderly behavior of the latter. See, you notice how he's describing it. He's not talking about laws or even regulations.
Right.
He's talking about discipline versus undisciplined.
Okay. Yeah, and again, that makes sense because they just came out of a fight for freedom. So.
Well, this is during the war.
That's during the war.
This is from 25 August 1776.
Okay.
This is a letter to one of his headquarters. I think one of his officers. He was kind of sending it because his officers were having issues with undisciplined soldiers.
Okay.
They were joining up the military, but they had no way of really training the soldiers at the time. So, and eventually they had a guy who they hired to actually train the colonial army.
Okay.
Right? But that came later, like I think in 1777. You might have started in 76, but it really kicked off in 77. But anyway, they were having a big trouble with discipline. And in fact, that's actually one of the reasons for the time, or at least during the war, George Washington hated the militia. He actually hated the militia.
Really?
But it was because...
That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
it's because of how undisciplined they were on the battlefield. So, wow.
No, listen, I've worked probably 24 hours in the last 2 days. It's funny because every Tuesday is when we record the podcast, and Monday is always a bear, and then Tuesday I get up and I go to work. Please continue.
No,
apologies all around. Please forgive.
No. So George Washington just really on the battlefield. Militias had a tendency to be
reckless,
undisciplined, and unreliable a lot of times.
Okay, I can see that.
So he just didn't like them in a military tactics viewpoint. Okay. So, however,
kind of like guerrilla fighters.
Right. So, however, later in his, let's see if I can find it now. Yeah. Later, on his address to Congress in 1794, when he was president,
okay,
he actually commends the idea of the militia. Okay, so he says, the devising and establishing of a well-regulated militia, again, and now we know what he thinks of what the term well-regulated is. We understand what he's talking about.
Right, he wants a well-disciplined, well-trained,
well-disciplined militia.
Okay.
He says this of that. He says, it would be a genuine source of legislative honor and a perfect title to public gratitude. I therefore entertain a hope that the present session will not pass without carrying to its full energy the power of organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and thus providing in the language of the Constitution for calling them forth to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And so he's quoting the Constitution.
Okay.
In that part. So he went from being really agitated with the militia during the war, but then still believed that it was an honor for the government to actually support the militias. All right. So
a well-trained, well-disciplined militia. So he's for the idea now.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he was ever against the idea of militias. He just hated them on the battlefield.
He was a soldier first.
Yeah, so he was a general, and he was a soldier, and he was a tactician.
Right.
And they always let him down, basically. Right. So he was just like, man. So anyway, so that kind of had actually another thing from George. Now there's a quote by George Washington that floats around the internet every once in a while. That's
"Stay strapped or get clapped."
Of course, that's what. No. It's one it derives from this actual quote.
Okay.
But it's a false quote, so it doesn't float around as nearly as much as it used to. But for a while it really was.
What is the false quote? Do you remember?
I would have to look it up again.
Okay.
But this is I might look it up later, but this is the actual quote. A free people ought not only be armed, but disciplined, to which end a uniform and well-digested plan is requisite, and their safety and interest require that they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent on others for essential, particularly of military supplies.
Okay. So basically meaning that he was worried about the supplies of the...
No, so he was basically he's basically saying that not only that we as a free people, we should be armed, disciplined, trained, and we should be independently capable of supplying our own stuff.
Okay.
Supplying our own means of fighting, essentially.
Right.
So we shouldn't be having to rely on outside sources to supply our weapons, ammunition, food, anything logistical. Right? We should be able to be self-contained and do it ourselves.
See, that's why I love that's why I love the founding fathers, because they wanted us to be self-sufficient in everything we did. to where the government comes alongside you and just says, hey, keep going, we're behind you, you know, keep doing what you're doing. Where now our government's like, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. Like, it makes no sense to me. Like, they are literally regulating life at this point.
Yeah.
And not training or behaving. I mean, they are literally regulating, today's definition, regulating life. From farming to trucking to everything, fishing and hunting. You have to have a fishing and hunting license to go fish and hunt.
That would be unheard of back in the... Not even, actually, it would be unheard of just 100 years ago.
Right. It makes no sense to me, but...
So there's another gentleman during the debates.
Okay.
He was not, I don't believe he was present at the debates. What he would do is he would write letters.
Write them in.
Yeah, he would write information and send it off to be read during those debates. And some of his biggest, like, he didn't just talk a little, like, it wasn't like snippets of quotes. It was like paragraphs about firearms and militias.
Wow.
So he was hardcore about having a militia and all that, right?
What was his name?
So his name was Richard Henry Lee. He would actually write his stuff as the Federal Farmer. All right, so that was like his pseudonym.
Okay.
Or alias for the letters. He would be signing it as the Federal Farmer, and it would be, and this one's from letter number 18.
Okay.
All right, from 25th January 1788. Okay. And he says, a militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and render regular troops in a great measure unnecessary. Now he was one of the people who was leery of a standing army.
Okay.
All right, so just keep that in mind. So, no, just to make sure I'm not that kind of guy. I do believe standing army is okay.
I think it's needed.
Right. But not at the expense of a militia. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on that. The powers to form and arm the militia, to appoint their officers, and to command their services are very important. Are very important. Nor ought they in a confederated republic to be lodged solely in any one member of the government. I guess that like the president. First, the Constitution ought to secure a genuine and guard against a select militia. We'll come back to that. By providing that the militia shall always be kept well organized, armed, and disciplined, and include, according to the past and general usage of the states, all men capable of bearing arms, and that all regulations tending to render this general militia useless and defenseless by establishing select corps of militia or distinct bodies of militiamen, not having permanent interest and attachment to the community, to be avoided.
Okay. As you're reading this, I'm trying to put together what it means in my head, and it's just like there's a lot going on in all of those.
Right. We don't talk like this anymore.
Right.
So I had to train myself to understand what they said, because we don't talk as eloquently as they did back then anymore.
Right.
We talk basically the same language, and we can write a book like you and I, just like this, and it'll be easily read. But we don't talk. This was like their normal talk back then, versus it's not our normal talk anymore. We're very plain spoken now, in comparison. But basically, what he's saying is that anything that would be designed, any kind of regulation that's designed to hinder the militia, should be avoided.
So any laws, any ruling against, the militia itself. Okay.
All right. Now he talks about the select militia. Okay.
What's that?
So that is, well, before I go into exactly what it is, I want to read what the Militia Act of 1792 said, kind of how it started.
Okay.
Because then you'll kind of understand when I explain what the select militia is, we'll understand kind of where I'm going with it. Okay? So, the Militia Act of 1792, it states this, that every citizen so enrolled and notified shall within 6 months thereafter provide himself, not to be provided by anyone else but himself, with a good musket or firelock, a sufficient bayonet and a belt, 2 spare flints and a knapsack, a pouch, and a box therein, to contain not less than 24 cartridges. So not only were they required to get a firearm, they needed the ammunition as well.
Right.
Suited to the bore of his musket or firelock, each cartridge to contain a proper quantity of powder and ball, or with a good rifle, knapsack, shot pouch, and powder horn, 20 balls suited to be to the bore of his rifle, and a quarter of a pound of powder, and shall appear to so armed, accoutered, and provided when called out to exercise or into service, except that when called out on company days to exercise only, he may appear without knapsack. So
they were supposed to keep all of this stuff on them at all times.
Yep. Well, at ready, so whenever they had to be called up, they can just grab and go.
So like a to-go bag by the front door.
Yeah. So kind of like the Minutemen.
Okay.
So you had to be ready in a minute and get out there, right?
Okay.
But if you notice, and now I think it's really cool that even back then, they differentiated musket and firelock from rifle.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah.
They actually were specific about which gun.
Right.
Whereas in the Second Amendment, they're not specific. They say arms.
Right, which is very general.
Very general.
It's basically, so arms, I'm glad you mentioned that, because arms, the definition of arms would be, I don't want to do the wrong, where are you? There he is. So for the definition of arms of that era, it was weapons of offense and armor for defense. So guess what? It includes body armor.
Yeah, armor plating. Yep.
So strange how they didn't really even have it back then, other than like shields, like old days shields and stuff.
Right.
But even they chose the word arms to include basically anything in the future. Go figure, right?
So it seems like they were looking ahead to what could possibly be.
Right. Oh yeah.
Which tells me, again, when we look at this Second Amendment and it talks in general and it says the right of the people to keep and bear, meaning carry. Bear does not mean grizzly. Bear means to carry. So the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So they were very general. They were very specific where they needed to be specific, and they were, general where they needed to be general.
Correct.
So shall not be infringed seems pretty specific.
Right.
Arms seems pretty general.
Right.
So even if you just study the context of that sentence, you can see that they were both general in areas and they were specific in areas.
Yep.
Because one thing that a lot of people like to say is that, arms was a specific to that time. It was a musket. It was a black powder rifle. It was single shot, powder and ball.
And I've never liked that idea, that argument is very, very flawed.
Okay.
Mainly because they already saw advancements in firearms.
Sure.
They knew they knew that at some point the self-contained cartridge would come along.
Right.
All right, because they were already trying to develop it. They just didn't have the technology at the time to get it going.
Back then, I think what they, if I'm not mistaken, they put the powder and the ball in an actual, like, almost paper cartridge or cartouche, which is French, I believe.
Right.
which that's where we get the word cartridge from.
Right.
So it was all wrapped together so they could stuff it down the barrel all at once, and then when it ignited, it hit the paper, lit the paper, paper lit the ball,
right,
or lit the powder ejected, shot the ball.
Right.
So they were already in trying to figure out how to contain all of that in one piece.
Right. And there were some of the founding fathers. Now, people don't think about this. Some of the founding fathers and earliest presidents were alive when the revolver was invented.
Ooh, that's a good point, because they had the black powder. They had a bunch of different ones.
The Colt.
The Colt.
The Colt.
Army.
The Colt Army.
Yeah.
Was invented in the 1830s. And
shortly after that, in the 1860s, is when they got the first rimless cartridge, like the 22 long rifle.
Mm-hmm.
Although it wasn't the 22.
They would have probably been. It would have been the following generation that would have seen that. But the fact that they were already seeing.
Right.
Machine gun, the idea of a machine gun, that came along like 50 years before. That idea came along like 50 years before the Revolutionary War.
Really?
To have, it was called the Puckle gun. You ever heard of that?
Mm-mm.
So the Puckle gun was basically almost like an early rudimentary version of the Gatling gun.
Okay.
So it'd be multiple barrels. It had one single barrel and it had multiple chambers.
Okay.
That they would load up, almost like a revolver.
Okay.
All right. It was like a revolver. Think of like a really big revolver on a tripod, but they're all flintlock.
Ooh.
Because that's one of the, again, they were limited by their technology at the time, not by their ideas. If they could come up, if they had the technology to invent a belt-fed machine gun, they would have done it. Because they were trying to already.
They were trying to figure out a way to shoot faster and reduce the reload time. Because reload time on a modern-day firearm, we're talking seconds, but back then would have been minutes.
Forever.
Would have been minutes. Like, you would have actually fired the shot and then dropped back so that the next set of guys could fire their shot.
Right.
And then they would have dropped back. And the whole time you're trying to sit there and reload your rifle.
Now, interesting, you're familiar with Lewis and Clark.
Yes.
So Lewis and Clark, they actually didn't bring, well, they did, but they didn't, they brought their muskets or rifles, to like Kentucky rifles and all that. But the other firearm they brought was the Ghirardelli air rifle.
Okay, what was that for?
So back then, air rifles were like having they're when we think air rifle now, we're thinking like Red Ryder.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
You'll shoot your eye out.
Right. Back then, now they do have them now. They're just not as common because, regular firearms have kind of took over.
Right.
But back then, air rifles were even better for like hunting, combat, that kind of thing. Or at least as far as like the frontier kind of stuff. The Ghirardelli rifle had a 20-round magazine. It could literally, it was semi-automatic.
Really?
Semi-automatic, and it was 20-round magazine.
And what year was this?
Shortly after the Revolutionary. So when did, like late 1800s, or late 1700s, early 1800s.
And they had an air rifle, which, that amazes me that they had an air rifle. How did they have an air rifle if they didn't have, like, the break action pump deal?
Yeah, well, they did.
They did?
You had to pump it. It took like 120 pumps to get it the way because it was designed, and I believe it was 50 caliber.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me get you a picture.
A little bit of research time.
Well, I just want him to see what it looks like. Yeah, man.
So for those of you that don't know, we have been going through this book if you're jumped in the middle of the podcast or something, we've been going through this book, which is basically quotations of the founding fathers and what they said about the Second Amendment. So this is what we're talking about. This is what we're going through here. Huh. It still had a flintlock, though?
No, it's just
an ignition system?
It didn't ignite anything. It was just the way it fired.
Huh. Man, I would love to take a look at this.
You can actually still buy them. Ghirardelli still exists. They still
really?
and they still make air rifles. And you can still buy that style because it's a collector's issue because Lewis and Clark and all that.
Right.
So you can actually go out there and buy one.
Wow.
Maybe we should do that sometime and test it out.
All right. So for those of you that are interested, look up, what is it?
Ghirardelli.
Ghirardelli.
Girandoni.
Ghirardelli rifle. Look it up. Apparently they had air rifles even back then. And you said it had a 20 round capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's interesting. So they, like you said, they were already developing. So again, crushing the argument that it didn't mean a gun that could shoot multiple shots at a time. It didn't mean this. It didn't mean that. Literally, we're debunking all of that right now.
Right. And then, okay, so now let's address that question you had about the select militia.
Select militia. What is it?
Basically, the select militia is what the modern day version of the National Guard is.
Okay.
It's essentially where you have a militia or a group that's considered the militia,
mm-hmm.
but it's basically falls under the federal government. It falls under the government. It falls under only certain. Okay, so let me say it like this. So we saw what the Militia Act said. Mm-hmm. It's like everyone who's able is required to, within 6 months of being old enough, essentially, to be in the militia.
Right.
Getting themselves a rifle, getting themselves all the equipment for it, all that stuff, right?
It was a requirement to have this stuff.
You needed to be able to do it. If you were going to...
And not only that, you needed to have enough powder, you needed to have enough shot, you needed to have enough everything.
Right.
And you had to have it in a bag ready to go so that if you had to take off and defend your area, you could do that.
Right. But if you notice, they always seem, like even Richard Henry Lee, he separated militia from select militia.
Okay.
All right. He when he
again being specific.
Right. He would talk about it. He would say the militia, and he would talk really highly of it, and he would talk about this is what needs to happen, and we said, but the select militia should be avoided. So it's like, well, what's a select militia, right?
Right.
So basically, so there's a in 1902.
Okay.
The efficiency of a militia bill was created.
In 1902, the efficiency of the militia. Okay.
Right. Basically, it established the National Guard. Okay. This is the actual.
Well, wouldn't it be the efficiency of the select militia then?
Yes, which would be the National Guard.
Okay.
Remember before the National Guard, it was state militias.
Right.
They always just consider the Massachusetts militia, the Virginia militia.
So do we know when it switched to National Guard, like the Florida
1902.
1902. Okay.
So this is basically I'm not going to say that the person's intention was ill-founded.
Okay.
I think he had the right idea. He wanted to support the militia, but in doing so, he kind of turned it into exactly what the founding fathers didn't want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and I kind of have it underlined in this right here, because I want you to hear. Now we heard what the original Militia Act said.
Okay.
Now I want you to hear what this says. Okay. All right. It says, provided that said rifles and carbines and other property shall be receipted for and shall remain the property of the United States and be annually accounted for by the governors of the states and territories as now required by law, and that each state, territory, and district shall, on receipt of the new arms, turn in to the Ordnance Department of the United States Army, without receiving any money credit, therefore, all United States rifles and carbines now it is in its possession.
Basically,
the exact opposite of what, and exactly what they were, what the found. We just read a lot of what the founding fathers said. We don't want that.
Right. They wanted you to be ready. You needed to have your own rifle. You needed to have your own amount of shot, your own amount of powder. You need to have it all ready to go. And now they're coming by saying, well, we want the United States to hold on to that stuff for you.
Right.
And not give you any money for it.
No. You can have to,
though you bought it yourself.
If we want you to turn it back in, that's it. You just give it back. We don't give you any anything in return.
So the creation of the select militia or the National Guard is almost essentially the beginning of when they started taking and regulating guns.
Yep, because it predates the NFA. It basically allowed for NFA, because now they have no need of the militias. Now they have the National Guard. You know, and I hate to say this because I have buddies who are in the National Guard or used to be. My wife had joined the National Guard.
Okay.
I have nothing against it. I think it's an honorable thing to be part of the National Guard.
Hey, they're the first ones in Florida. Anytime there's a giant hurricane, they're the first boots on the ground. So,
but the way it was organized is what I consider unconstitutional, or at least, okay, let me rephrase. The fact that it replaced state militias is what's unconstitutional.
Okay.
If they had just established the National Guard as a type of branch of the military, I'd have no problem with it. Learning, reading, and understanding what the founders said about those kind of things and what they wanted and didn't want, and then reading exactly what is in the Efficiency of a Militia Act or bill, which established the National Guard, tells me that it was exactly the opposite of what the founders wanted. So like I said, the idea behind it is fine. I'm sure he had the people who voted for it and were like, hey, this is a good idea. Their heart was probably in the right place, but in doing so, they kind of screwed the pooch, essentially. And that basically that was like probably one of the first big domino effects that hit and started going and leading to where we are now.
Well, they probably said back then what they're saying now is that we're not gonna come for your guns.
Right.
We're not gonna come and take your guns away. We just want to have the guns that you're gonna use. We want to hold on to them.
Right. Or more.
That's what they said back then.
More accurately, it would be we want to provide you the weapons.
Okay.
We're loaning you these things.
Which back then, if you think about it, would have been, I almost feel like that would have been a good idea because they could keep it clean. I don't know. There's an argument for both sides because, who's going to keep their rifle clean more than the one who owns the rifle?
Right. Actually, let's see if I can find this quote.
Because I started to say, I feel like, they can keep it clean, they can keep it maintained, they're spending the money for it. But then I thought, who's going to take more care of the rifle? Somebody who's it's not their rifle, they're just holding on to it, or someone that's my rifle. I depend on that for my life.
So, I like that you said that.
Okay.
Because Patrick Henry would agree with you.
Let's hear Patrick Henry then.
So Patrick Henry said this: "Are we at last brought to such humiliating and debasing degradation that we cannot be trusted with arms for our defense? Where is the difference between having our arms in possession and under our direction and having them under the management of Congress? If our defense be the real object of having those arms, in whose hands can they be trusted with more propriety or equal safety to us as in our own hands? And then he went on to say, let my beloved Americans guard against that fatal lethargy that has pervaded the universe. Have we the means of resisting disciplined armies when our only defense, the militia, is put into the hands of Congress? So he would not have agreed with the militia or the Efficiency of Militia Act.
So let me ask you this: is the National Guard is run by each individual state now, though, isn't it? I mean, that's still technically federal government.
Yeah, but if you think about it,
but it's under the state's control.
Sort of. I mean, think about it. We went through a whole 20 years of war, and guess what? The National Guard was easily ordered by the president to go overseas.
Yep.
The president requested the National Guard be at the White House in this last inauguration.
Okay.
And they did it. You see what I'm saying? The National Guard is no longer... Basically, if the president requests it, the governor, if they want to stay chummy with the president, they're going to do it. It's no longer a checks and balances. Now it's, I still want your federal... Because remember, states get federal money. Funding.
Right.
All the president has to be like, if you don't give me your National Guard, you don't get my funding. And guess what? Very few governors are going to be like, we don't need your money.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you have that. And then, but then of course their equipment is all federal.
All U.S.
federal.
Military.
Yeah.
Like
every tank.
The Army National Guard comes from the armory, or the armory of the Army.
They get sworn in with the exact same oath.
Right.
At the exact same place as the active military and reserves. So when I swore in, I had National Guard in the same room.
Okay.
I think they have to do an additional swearing. They swear in with us, but then they also swear in with their government, with their state officials, if I'm not mistaken. If you're in the National Guard, let me know.
Put in the comments.
But then they go to basic training with just like all the other people. They go to AIT just like all the others.
Right.
They're almost you can't even differentiate between them as far as like their training and all that, which is what the Efficiency of the Militia Act was designed for. Hey, let's get them the same training as the active, which is cool, right?
Right.
But in doing so, it's the other part of, well, now you're basically us.
And you have to follow our orders.
Yeah.
As we give them.
Right, and you can only use our equipment. You can only use the federal government's equipment.
I feel like some states have liberties, though, and I'll tell you why. When the last major hurricane, Hurricane Ian, came through, our governor, Ron DeSantis, sent down the National Guard with their helicopters, their vehicles.
Yeah, which are they allowed to.
All kinds of things, and he sent it down to South Florida, where I'm from. And it's kind of funny because my dad said that one day he was driving down the highway and he saw a giant Chinook helicopter taking one of those like containers, those containers that they turn into offices.
Oh yeah.
He said he saw that flying over into Sanibel, which Sanibel, for those that don't know, got the bridge going into Sanibel got destroyed in 3 different places. So it was a state of emergency. It was a national disaster. And Ron DeSantis sent in our troops and got stuff done. So I feel like you said there was 2 swearing-ins. There's a swear-in for them for the president, but there's also a swearing-in of them for their state.
Right.
So kind of federally and local.
Right.
Which I find that there is a need for that, but I would agree with you. I feel like if the federal government can control it, they can, well, if nothing else, they can take the funding away.
Right.
They can absolutely say, oh, you're not going to play ball with us? Hey, here's...
Well, according to the Militia Act, or that the efficiency of militia, they can call in that receipt. Remember when that whole part that I read was they can recall all that equipment. That's on loan.
Right.
So every tank, that Chinook that brought in the stuff, that's the federal government's.
Yeah.
They could be like, hey, we need that back. And guess what they have to, and if the governor says no, all right, we have the active military that can come and take it from you.
Right.
So
let me ask you this, and then this is one of those topics, like, put a little disclaimer down here. Careful what you say. In the event of a civil war, would you think that it would be like the Army versus the people, or the Army versus the National Guard and the people, or like, how do you think that would work? It's hard to say, right?
How about this? How about we do that for another video, because that's going to be another big topic.
All right.
Because there's a lot of variables with that one.
There's a lot of variables, and you know what? As a Second Amendment guy, you have to think about these things. You know, even not as a Second Amendment person, just as an American citizen, you have to think, because look, I bet you, every one of you right now that would say, oh, you guys are paranoid, you guys are worried about things that are civil war, that's not going to happen. I bet you a bunch of people on one side of the island, why can I not think of the name, I'm drawing a blank, Ukraine. I bet you a bunch of people in Ukraine, half of them probably thought, oh, that'll never happen. Now look what they're going through. So... we're not fear mongers. That's one thing I hate. I cannot stand these YouTube guys that go on and they'll say, like, it'll be clickbait, right? It'll be like, that's it, World War III has started.
Right.
It's like, no. And he would say, like, the title would say that, but then he'd say, this is what the person in Congress so-and-so said.
Like,
and that was the start of World War III? Who declared it? Nobody. It was a clickbait thing. I can't stand that. Sorry, rant over.
Yeah, you got to be careful on a lot of what floats around on the internet, just because I guarantee you the next big conflict is going to be something that started on the internet.
You think so?
I think so.
Do you mean like the next big world conflict?
Not necessarily, just for us, like within like the American headspace.
Okay.
I mean, think about it. Every riot that's been is because of something that popped up on the internet and exploded on the internet.
Yep.
Usually in snippets, just enough to make people angry.
Right, because they don't show you the whole video, guys. Look. Right. One thing I'm going to tell you, I watch videos all the time. Like, I watch training videos that are, I watch different videos all the time. And one thing I know is you have to watch the whole video. You have to get the full context. And going back to what we were talking about in this book, if he would have just read well-regulated militia, that's what George Washington said, that's what Patrick Henry said, that's what all these guys said, that would be a way for someone to say, see, look, even they agreed with well-regulated. But since he read the entirety of that quote, you get what they were saying. They were talking about disciplined and trained people. Community people, not army people. So I just feel like when it comes to these videos, y'all have to watch them in their entirety. Don't just watch it where someone else started that video, right? Because they could edit it. They could make it look worse. That's why, if you've noticed, a lot of these police shootings, they've been releasing the videos almost right away. Mm-hmm. So that way it almost combats everything anyone else can say. Right. Like, you see a 10-second clip of a cop with his knee in someone's back, which is a legal thing to do. It's a legal way to pin somebody to the ground, but it's raining and their knee kind of slides up towards, the back of their neck, and all you see is a 10-second video of that cop with somebody in their knee on their neck. You're going to think, wow, haven't we learned this lesson yet?
Right.
But if you watch the whole entirety of the video, you see he had him pinned, it was slippery, he slipped a little bit, and then he corrected his knee and put it back where it needed to be. But all you see is the 10 seconds of that video with the officer with his knee on his neck.
Right.
And then
all of a sudden that 10 seconds
riots start.
Yeah, turns into more people getting hurt.
Right.
So
it's insane.
So yeah, I think I want to write. It's long.
Okay.
But I think it's important.
We'll go ahead and we'll
end it.
Finish up on this.
Yeah. This is George Mason.
Okay.
All right. 1788, June 14th, during the ratification debates. So, and this is actually kind of talking about standing armies, military versus militia, all that kind of thing, right? And this really comes down to the heart of the Second Amendment.
Okay.
And he prefaces it this way. He says, "No man has a greater regard for the military gentlemen than I have. I admire their intrepidity, perseverance, and valor. But when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. When against a regular and disciplined army, yeomanry are the only defense," which is the militia. "Yeomanry, unskillful and unarmed, what chance is there for preserving freedom? Mm-hmm. Give me leave to recur the page of history." Now I like how he does it because he actually goes into history.
Okay.
It's just like how we have to do it today. He does it the same thing. "To warn you of our present danger, recollect the history of most nations of the world, what havoc, desolation, and destruction have been perpetrated by standing armies. An instance within the memory of some in this house will show us how our militia may be destroyed. 40 years ago," which would have been in the 1750s,
okay,
"when the resolution of enslaving America was formed in Great Britain, the British Parliament was advised by an artful man." The man in question was Sir William Keith.
Okay.
"Who was governor of Pennsylvania at the time, to disarm the people, that it was the best and most effectual way to enslave them, but that they should not do it openly, but weaken them, and let them sink gradually, by totally disguising and neglecting the militia." And then, of course, he goes on and more. "This was a most iniquitous project. Why should we not provide against the danger of having our militia, our real and natural strength, destroyed? The general government ought, at the same time, to have the same such power, but we need not give them power to abolish our militia. They neglect to arm them, or if they neglect to arm them and prescribe proper discipline, they will be of no use. I am not acquainted with the military profession. I beg to be excused for any errors I may commit with respect to it, but I stand on the general principles of freedom, whereon I dare to meet anyone."
Okay. So he said, "I'm not a soldier." At the end there, kind of paraphrasing, he said, "I'm not a soldier. I think it's a very onerous thing." He said, "But I will go toe-to-toe with anyone that wants to argue freedom."
Pretty much.
Seems to me like somewhere there's been a translation, a lost in translation thing.
Heavy.
Yeah.
Heavy We've lost so much.
Misinterpretation. There you go.
Misinterpretation, just overall we've lost it. Somewhere down we lost the message, and unfortunately, it's been hard to regain that message.
Sure.
Mainly because there's not a whole lot of people who still think this way.
Well, it's like you said earlier. A lot of people would rather just go with the flow rather than. I mean, look what happened when some people tried to go to the Capitol and protest.
Right.
You know, I don't believe that we should have done it violently, but that's how it ended up. It was mostly peaceful, but then a little violence ended up happening and some stuff happened.
Well, I'm not going to go into that because
it's.
I have my opinions on that whole deal, and it's just like. But anyway.
So, this was a long one, guys. Thank you for anyone that made it this far. I appreciate you. We appreciate you. Hey, listen. We're just a couple of guys that believe in the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, and we want to make sure that we interpret it right. Because if we're wrong, we'll be the first to tell you, hey, man, we got that one wrong. But when we're right, we're willing to defend it.
Right.
So this has been a really long one, but it was a fun one for me. I'm pretty sure that you can say the same for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, last minute little hint. This book was written by a very valuable guy. You know it. I know it.
Right.
What's the book name of the book?
It's called Defensio Civium.
Defensio Civium. And where can they find that book? On Amazon?
Yeah, on Amazon.
All right. Look it up. Defensio
Civium.
Civium.
Basically the civil defense.
Civil defense.
In Latin.
In Latin. That's it. That's all we got. Any last minute wisdom?
Yeah, by George Mason. I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people, except for a few public officials.
The whole people except for the few public officials. Because politicians will be politicians.
Right.
Thanks for joining us, guys. It's been a fun one. We got some new stuff coming up on the wall. We're testing our sounds out, so we're getting there, guys. We're slowly building. We're building this thing, so I appreciate you guys. I know the ones who are watching. Thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with us. Have a good one.
Laters.